亲爱的贵宾，非常感谢你今天莅临气候变迁下的族群韧性与在地知识论坛。首先有请国立台湾大学社会科学院王宏年院长为我们这次的活动致辞。Please welcome Professor Wang.
Director Zheng, Deputy Minister Wang, Professor Zhou, and our honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure to be here to welcome you to the College of Social Sciences at National Taiwan University. I'd like to particularly extend my warm welcome to friends from abroad who travel long distance to come here for this conference. So this is an international conference on climate change, which is organized by the Research Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, where the Professor Zheng is the current director. I personally have the privilege and the great honor to be the former director of this institute, so I guess I know one thing or two about this institute. So this institute was created as a platform to provide research support to the communities in the humanities and social sciences. And one of the major goals of this platform is to promote cross-discipline research collaborations to study topics that are not only on the academic frontier, but also have important policy values to the local society. So over the years, quite a few conferences and workshops have been held to promote such research collaborations. And the topics have touched issues including artificial intelligence, neuroscience, data science, climate change, indigenous research, etc. And so today the conference is about climate change with the additional focus on how the indigenous communities use their local knowledge to respond to the change. I know this is two-day events. With today here, you're here to listen to a few, I'm sure, the excellent keynote speeches. And tomorrow you'll move to another university for panels of discussions and presentations. So I hope this conference will not only promote and showcase the multidisciplinary research collaboration, but it will also give our local scholars the opportunity to work with the foreign experts and hopefully eventually leading to cross-country research collaborations. So thank you very much. I hope this, I wish this conference a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for the inspirational speech. Next, let's welcome our second guest of honor, Professor Kipasangu Veyana Min Hui Wang, for opening remark. Professor Min Hui Wang is the Deputy Minister of Council of Indigenous Peoples. Let's welcome Professor Wang. 谢谢王主任，接下来请原住民主委也是汪明辉副主委为我们致辞。
No, do you know? Azu pokai kaibu, eto sola bumeme adu, ananasi aname, ananasi aname. Mire no ana o azu bitotonu edo sola mo mamaizo ananasi aname ananasi aname. Malawi, Maladohaisa, Yeni Muit Offici, Mauta Tonsia, Tisco, Tisokoia, Mananahia, Amdu Abayo, Yuputan, 我们到手到路等下吼，路到路吼，有爱的都我们打有啊，不要到时候手一上咯，拿18号，我就是那里马飞飞那么好，把这数那都很那么，把这干那边好，打上那非常好，我看看。我尊敬的外国的贵宾，我们今天王院长，还有台大人事中心副主任周教授，还有各位在座的贵宾，各位朋友，大家早安，大家好。我今天要用中文说哈。我刚才一开始，我以阿里山州族的很古老的歌谣，来为这一场的聚会做祝福。歌词的大意是。我们今天非常的高兴，我们能够从这个各个地方不远千里而来，尤其是我们尊敬的外国的贵宾到这个地方来，我们齐聚一堂，是多么高兴的一件事情。那我们过去的祖先在这个土地上生存，都是非常努力。那作为我们，身为子孙，我们应该要学习他们的精神啊。那我接着我用主语，借由这个土地的土地神，我祈求土地神赐福给每一位在座的，有一个非常洁净的灵魂、清晰的思虑，还有健康的身体。愉快的精神，祝福各位。今天非常的荣幸，能够代表原住民族委员会来这里，一方面来学习，一方面也是要欢迎各位，尤其是我们外国的贵宾来出席这一场盛会。那这一场盛会是有关于气候变迁。韧性，还有地方知识。那我想，过去这10年来，甚至更久，20年来，我们由于气候的变迁，尤其是极端气候，似乎在台湾，在我们的岛上，本来就是有很多的所谓自然灾害，但是呢，最近这段时间，我们经历了很多的灾难，我记得88风灾的第1年、第2年，我曾经办过研讨会，在座的 Richard Hoy 教授也受邀参与。那时候我们原住民大部分中南部的原住民部落都受到非常大的一个创伤甚至有很多的生命丧失。那这样的一个冲击，给了我们对于人跟土地、社会跟环境，或者是我们国家在这个发展的这个过程当中，我们对环境或者永续的这样的一个关系的议题上，有更实际的一个体验，还有检讨。那在10年之后，我们今天在很多的一个过去研究的这个前人的很多的杰出的研究，比如说在座的等一下专题演讲的Berkes 教授他的这个过去的一些智慧，以及在过去我们台湾许许多多的学者或者是专家、政府官员对于灾后重建、韧性等等相关议题的这些研究的基础之上，我们进一步在今天希望能够再做一个10年之后的一个讨论，我觉得是深具意义我们希望在这个研讨会的这些议程里头，希望大家都能够有一个非常好的一个互动跟交流。其实会后我们也会在国内外的学者，我们也会再去看10年之后灾后重建的原住民的情况 我们会去看它的永久屋这件事情啊，或者是说它的文化、它的教育、它的语言。因为我讲的是原住民，因为很多今天关于韧性或者是传统知识，很多都是跟原住民有密切关系，所以我们会带学者们也会去看，然后跟当地的族人有些交流看看我们是不是有一个这个很好的一个跟我们今天在论坛上可以做回馈的地方。我想这是会有很积极的意义，不管是对学术界或对政策的一个参考，我觉得会是一个非常好的一个参考点最后借此祝福大家希望有一个非常丰硕愉快的研讨会的一天。谢谢各位。
谢谢汪副主委、温副主任。我们紧接着即将进行第一场的专题演讲，我们要请汪副主委担任主持人，替我们引荐今天的主讲人。Let's thank Deputy Minister Wang for the inspiring speech. Now, Professor Wang is going to chair the first keynote section and introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Victor Burgess.
非常的荣幸，也非常的骄傲，能够担任这第一场的专题演讲的主持跟介绍人那我们第一场演讲非常难得，邀请我刚刚提到的Victor Burgess 教授我想在座应该都非常熟悉不管是年长一辈或者是年轻一代的，我想对他大家都是会读过他的书或读过他的文章那我想我就尽我应该尽到的责任，我用中文来这个来描述他过去的一些经历那 Burgess 教授他是加拿大曼尼托巴的特聘名誉教授，他早在1973年的时候就获得加拿大麦基尔 McGill 大学的海洋科学的博士。那他是一位以应用生态学者的背景，常年从事自然社会科学界面的研究工作致力于调查研究各种社会以及资源利用间的关系。他的研究专精于理论实践面向的人类环境系统互联性，还有社区本位的管理、韧性与原住民族传统生态知识体系等领域。他与加拿大及国际上许多的原住民共同工作。他的研究团队早在1999年到2001年已经执行有关气候变迁、原住民族韧性与在地知识的研究你看那是20多年前，20年后我们今天在这里举行类似这样的一个题目，可以说我们晚了他20年，可以是真正的一个pioneering， 就是一个先锋性的研究先驱那 Burgess 教授参与过的计划包含这个 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment 千禧年的生态系统的评估，还有联合国开发计划署关于保育和发展的赤道倡议 Equator Initiative， 生物多样性还有生态系统服务的政府间科学政策平台的原住民族与在地知识体系专业行动团队等。他曾经获得很多奖，主要的大奖包含国际自然保育联盟的环境、社会与经济政策委员会。他在2016年首届杰出研究奖，那这个是 Inaugural Award for Meritorious Research， 还有国际共有资源研究协会的2015年Elinor Ostrom Award for Senior Scholar， 就是纪念诺贝尔经济学奖 Elinor Ostrom 的一个资深学者奖，还有他的著作 Sacred Ecology， 神圣生态学这一书，他在2014年的时候 获得美国生态学会评阅的期刊颁发的 Sustainability Science Award 永续科学奖等，所以这些奖都是非常的显示非常的杰出的一个研究，不只是研究多，而且是很杰出。他到现在为止出版了250余篇的经过审查的一个论文，另外他有11本的专书，包含刚才讲的 Sacred Ecology， 他在2018年的时候就出版第4版，还有航向社会系统 Navigating Social Ecological System， 那还有 Coast for People 人们的海洋等等名著。那我们今天非常的高兴他在我们现场，我们现在就以热烈邀请他上台。 Please welcome Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, for your very generous introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all that credit. A lot of people work in these areas, and I'm just one of the researchers. As you probably know, somebody doing research really depends on a team of people and many others and many colleagues who share ideas, who do similar work, who look at issues, who criticize one another. And of course, part of the reason we're here is that we want to learn from one another and share experiences. It's an honor for me to be here, my third trip to Taiwan. I do know that indigenous people of Taiwan have in fact a lot to contribute to this discussion, although so far in the international literature you really don't see very much about Taiwan. So here we are also with the idea that we could perhaps stimulate some research for the younger people and stimulate some publications for the experienced people. My topic today is very much along the lines of the main title, so I'm going to try to cover some of these main areas. Part of our context is that climate change is not only a serious issue, but it's basically run away from us. So we are past the point of prevention, we're past the point of mitigation, we're really talking adaptation. And if we're talking adaptation, that gets us into resilience, but it also becomes really important to find out about what people are seeing in their local environments. Indigenous people are particularly good in being observers of their local environment. So we need to look at their observations, we need to learn from them, and we need to combine it with science. Now, part of our task is that when faced with rapid global environmental change, we need to look for creative responses. So combining these topics, that you don't really see these three topics together very often. And that's I think, part of the creative approach that this conference takes. There are implications for policies, for governance, for government to take actions, but of course it's not only governments that do governance. The nature of climate change related disaster shocks is that they're unpredictable. So it's very difficult for governments to actually deal with them, and that's why we need to look at governance issues. What can we learn from local knowledge? So here's my plan. I'm going to talk about the concept of resilience and its significance for climate change. But I take the broader view of risks and hazards. I'm referring to disaster shocks. They're not only from climate change, of course. As you know, Taiwan also has earthquakes and tsunamis and so on, which are not related to climate change. But But they have a similar kind of structure in terms of what happens and what policy responses may have to do. The second area, and this is going to be the larger part of the talk, is how local and indigenous knowledge can help build resilience. And the third area, which is going to be shorter and will tie up the two ends, is about governance. And I'm going to talk about adaptive governance, meaning governance that learns and moves on, and learns some more and moves on. And that's the way to approach an unpredictable situation as we have with disaster shocks. Okay, simplest definition of resilience is the ability to respond to change. Resilience doesn't mean coming back to the same point. In fact, in most resilient systems, you do not get back to exactly the same point. But what you do is you respond to change in a positive and creative way. The usual definition, the technical definition by Brian Walker and colleagues, is that resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and to reorganize while undergoing change, as the change actually continues. But the resilient system still retains essentially the same function, structure, and identity. So it's a systems-based definition of resilience. In less technical language, resilience is the capacity of a system, if you can think about a community or a region, to absorb disturbances, such as floods and typhoons. And of course, climate change gives us an increased frequency of floods and typhoons. Not just in Taiwan, it's everywhere. More so in some areas than others, but still everywhere. Why is resilience important for our discussion? We're dealing with disaster shocks. It helps, first point is that it helps evaluate hazards holistically. But for that holistic thing, we need to use not just the ecosystem as ecologists do, but we need to look at the social ecological system, the people in combination with their environment. A community in, say, northern Taiwan, a Tayal community that plants its crops, lives in that environment, and you need to look at that system holistically as not just the Tayal village, but the Tayal village, their crops, their animals, what they hunt, what they see, the way they look at the world. That's the holistic, looking at social and the ecological together. This is what I've tried to do. Also my professional life, coming from natural sciences, converted into social sciences. We need to deal with both. You can't just look at society and you can't just look at the physical environment. The second reason resilience is important is that it puts the emphasis on the system to deal with a disturbance, usually called coping, and then to adapt to it and sometimes transform. In a moment I'll expand on these. The third reason for resilience and why it's important is that resilience is forward-looking. It's not looking at the past, it's not looking at the current system. Let's say vulnerability does that, but it's not really forward-looking. Resilience, by definition, is forward-looking. Therefore, it helps us explore policy options. Now, to expand on the first point, I picture a complex adaptive system which includes the social side and the ecological side. as a set of relationships between people and their environment, and these are nested one inside the other. They are multi-level or multi-scale, depending on your terminology. And we have used the social ecological system, SES, as the unit of analysis in dealing with resilience, climate change, all these things. And we worked on it mainly with colleagues from Sweden, Carl Folke and others, from the initial book we did in 1998 to later works. So this is my unit of analysis. To expand on the concept of resilience, think of it as a continuity. So there is coping, there is adapting, and in some cases transforming. As there is an intensity of change, does this work? Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so as there is increasing intensity of change, you go from coping, which is really persisting under pressure from a change factor, to moving on to incremental adjustment, or what we call adaptive capacity, and this requires flexibility. So if you exceed the ability of a system to cope, then you're in an adaptive mode. And if you exceed the adaptive capacity of the system, then you may be looking at transformative capacity. In other words, if enough mountain villages in Taiwan get hit by floods and cyclones, and they can no longer live there and no longer make a living, then they become urban dwellers. They become urban people, and that's a different system from living in your village up in the mountains. So that's what I mean by transformation. These three things together are part of that resilience continuum. So resilience doesn't necessarily mean you can deal with any change. It means there is a staged ability to cope, to adapt, and if you exceed that, then you transform. You become something else. Here indeed is some Taiwan scenes from my first visit in the Taiwan country. You can see landslides. And the hillsides are so steep, you're going to get landslides. Even if people did not plant anything, or even if you didn't have special extra strong typhoons. But people know how to deal with this, and one way to deal with it is to use the nice soil to grow crops. I think cabbage in this case, and that's a nice cash crop. And people have used the disaster, they've turned it into an opportunity to grow things and make a living from that. Okay, so that requires traditional knowledge. I prefer the term traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, but the current IPBS, the International Program for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, uses the term ILK, meaning indigenous and local knowledge. So I'm going to refer to ILK to capture traditional, indigenous, local. We define it as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief. It's not static. It evolves by adaptive processes, meaning it evolves by learning and relearning. And it's the kind of knowledge that's handed down through generations by cultural transmission, not book learning, not university learning. I've never taught a course on traditional knowledge because I don't think I can do it in a classroom. I would have to take the students out on the land, but then I don't have the skills that the traditional knowledge holder does. So I've never taught it. I've taught about it, but I've never taught traditional knowledge itself. And I'm not indigenous, so in fact, I shouldn't. So more simply, IK is local knowledge held by indigenous peoples, and local knowledge is knowledge and important, but it's not time-tested over generations. Okay, so ILK is significant for the indigenous peoples themselves for a whole range of reasons. We have to keep in mind, it's not just for our own use and benefit. It's important for the indigenous people. Their knowledge is important for themselves. But it's also important for all of us as the common heritage of humanity. And it's important to combine with Western science, or maybe Western isn't a very good word, but you know, sort of modern science. Because then you give, if you combine traditional knowledge with modern science, you can tackle certain problems in a fuller way. It helps build resilience. That's the major point we want to get into. ILK increases the range of knowledge available, and it's a source of adaptive capacity. And it leads to mutual learning, which in turn is important for governance. How it increases the range of knowledge. This is a figure used by IPBES. It's from Maria Tengo and colleagues in Sweden. Think of each kind of knowledge as a strand. We don't usually combine these strands. They are separate. They have their own logic. Social science is actually quite different from natural science in the way issues are approached, and so is traditional knowledge. And these various strands, when used together, we talk about bridging knowledge, enriching knowledge, and co-producing knowledge. Now, we're in our second area here, so we're talking about adaptive capacity with indigenous knowledge, and I'm going to give two examples here, actually three later on. The first is the example of the potato park in Peru. Why is ILK is a source of adaptive capacity? This park, Parque de la Papa, is a biocultural heritage. It's not a national park. It's not it doesn't have international designation. It's not controlled by government. It's run by indigenous Quechua people themselves. It's important to them because these are the people who are at the center of origin of the potato plant. So the park conserves crop genetic diversity for the Quechua people, but in fact for the whole world, because it's a large area with different types of ecosystems, and therefore different types, different varieties of potatoes. But it belongs to them because it's potato has deep cultural roots for the Quechua. And this is, by the way, the former area of the Inca Empire. So we're not talking about recent traditional practice and knowledge. We're talking about thousands of years of history of people interacting with their crops. I heard that there may be some interest in Taiwan with indigenous people looking at some of their indigenous crops and conserving their biocultural diversity that way, like millets. So that would actually be a very nice application, a similar kind of logic. The park is large, 9,000 hectares, goes from an altitude of a few hundred meters all the way to 4,000 something meters, so it's very high. You can see some of these different kinds of ecosystems: lowlands, small hills, higher hills. It's amazing that there's something like 1,300 varieties of potatoes being conserved in this area. 8 species. In Canada, we plant about 4 varieties of potatoes. In Taiwan, I don't know how many, but not many. And if there is climate change and the environment changes and you need your potato varieties are not growing very well, what do? Where do you go? Well, you go to the source of genetic diversity. So that's why having a conservation area with 1,300 varieties is a source of a crop for a changing world. The second example I want to talk about is Bolivian Andes. This is more specifically about climate change, and I'm talking about use of local traditional knowledge for understanding climate variability and where it may be going. First of all, these are also people of the Andes, and the people of the Andes are experts in adapting to unpredictable changes. They are experts in what you might call risk management. They plant not continuous farms, but they plant small plots within an area. So what you have here is holdings of one family. There's a plot here, a plot here, a plot here, a plot here. The idea is that in a given year, not all of the plots are going to work, but some will. So think of it as an investment strategy. You don't want to put all your all your money in one basket. You want to spread it around. You want the diversity of investments. Some will go up, some will go down. And these guys have discovered this long before the economists managing money discovered that principle. This is an area where they observe climate change, as you find in many places. Climate is on the average warmer, yes, but that's really not the point. What they're seeing is they don't see average changes, and that's why the global models are so inadequate. What they see are specific impacts: increase in crop pests, shrub encroachment up to highland areas into pastures. And what they see are different impacts only a few kilometers apart. In the highlands, the concern is about violent rains. In the valleys, the concern is about drought. You can see two, in fact, opposite kinds of climate impacts in a short distance apart. No amount of modeling studies are going to give you that. Only local observations can give you that. You also find that some farmers take advantage of changes to grow potatoes where they had never grown before. Potatoes up to 4,000 something. Here's a map. So our postdoc Sebastian Goya mapped these. He wasn't really looking at climate change initially, but he looked at where people were planting, and he found that there was an extension of planting areas. So the cultivation lands now go up to 4,300 meters. And these are lands that nobody ever planted before. The two white spots, by the way, are the remnants of 2 glaciers, and Andean glaciers are disappearing so fast, in 20 years there will be no white on that map. So, a lesson from these cases is that Local observations are good for fine-scale impacts, fine-scale differences of climate change effects. And they don't displace, they don't replace global and regional models, but they add some reality to these models. And very important reality, because impacts happen on the ground, they don't happen on maps. And it also shows us there actually may be some positive effects of climate change as well. Probably it will not outweigh the negative effects, but there may be some positive effects. Now, observations such as the ones I talked about have been replicated in the literature, and we're talking about published peer-reviewed literature. And the team by Savo et al. Reviewed these studies and found something over 1,000 studies of local observations of climate change, not just indigenous, but observations by farmers, fishers, herders, of people observing change, impacts of change, and also adaptations, and mapped out. This is a paper you should really look at. They mapped out these observations, and what you see is that you see a lot of studies from East Africa, West Africa, Andes, the North, Canadian North and Alaska, huge number of studies in the Himalaya region. I think Taiwan is here, and there are no studies among that 1,000-something from Taiwan. So we would like to see some. We would like to see some. So our colleagues here, please get going on this. But the point is, there's now a huge number of network of observations that show what people are seeing, and they add immensely to the amount of science of climate change that we do have. Give you one more example of knowledge, in this case also knowledge co-production. This is from northern Norway, Sami herders, with apologies to my Finnish colleague who's also going to talk about Sami voices. What I saw in the Sami land, first of all, is that indigenous ways of knowing, way of observing, understanding and knowing the environment are really quite different from Western science. That doesn't mean you throw out Western science, but it doesn't mean you dismiss indigenous knowledge either. It's just different. But for smart researchers, these are complementary kinds of knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is often qualitative. Oh, thank you. Indigenous knowledge is qualitative. They're not interested in numbers. I don't know of any indigenous group that actually is preoccupied by numbers. I don't. There may be some, but I just don't know. Inuit don't even bother. In Inuit counting, you say 1, 2, many. There's no 12, there's no 14. Science, of course, is quantitative, right? But you can do quantitative measurements with only a small number of variables in a complex system. But with qualitative assessment, you can eyeball a very large number of variables, and I've seen this in a number of different indigenous groups, and the example comes up is from northern Norway. Snow monitoring. So snow is that white stuff that in the picture. Okay, this is a reindeer herd. A herd belongs to a family, but it moves over a large area, and then it has big seasonal movements. But these are the local winter movements. They move locally because they compact the snow and can't get at their feed, and therefore they need to move after a few days in any one area. The Finnish system works somewhat differently, right? But this is northern Norway, Kautokeino. So you need to know about snow conditions. The Sami herders get on their snow machines every few days, and the herd in the meantime is moving. The Sami don't move the herds. The herd moves itself, and the Sami facilitate them. You see this in many indigenous people. The active partner is the environment. It's not the humans. Humans help, but the animals decide, or the plants. So what they do is the herder checks the snow conditions. There are many things the herder is checking, but there's one very important factor, and that's the amount of crusting in the snow. And crusting occurs when you have rain that comes at the wrong time. You get snow, and then you get rain, and then it freezes, and you get a crust, and the animals cannot dig down to the food they feed on. That's a very major impact. So what the herder does, the fellow with the earmuffs, is Aslak the herder, and he's making a snow profile. In this particular snow profile, he found 2 layers of crusts, but he judged that it was not too difficult for his reindeer to dig through. He's looking at many other variables, so I asked him, I said, well, you're doing qualitative assessment, so why do you need to find the exact depth, 60 centimeters snow depth? He said, it's not for me, it's for the Norwegian government. Because we are the ears and eyes of the Norwegian government. We give them certain quantitative measurements that they cannot come and take. Well, they can, but it would cost a lot of money. So here's your co-production of knowledge, that he's giving them the snow depth. He's also giving them, you see this? That's a temperature gauge. He's giving them the ground temperature. Those are the 2 major things that Norwegian Minister of Environment wants and needs from the Sami. Okay, so a couple of lessons here. One about the importance of on-the-ground information for monitoring. And I didn't show you much, but their snow knowledge is astounding. Their snow terminology exceeds the Inuit snow terminology by far. These are real snow people. Part of the reason their terminology is so rich is that they communicate with other herders. They have to tell them where the crusting is occurring and what kind of snow you got. They focus on a huge number of factors, but this one factor, which is related to climate change, is the freezing rain event. It's an extreme event. Extreme event comparable to, let's say, flooding in my home area of Manitoba, or landslides, or the kind of extreme events here. So what they do is qualitative, but they know if they have to provide quantitative, they can and will. Now, talking so much about ILK, I have to say there's some cautions. It's not up for grabs. Okay, it has to be used for caution because indigenous knowledge has a cultural context. It cannot be taken out of that context. So it has to be used respectfully, preferably. It has to be used together with partners who are knowledge holders themselves. So it's not a matter of extracting indigenous knowledge, but it's a matter of partnerships. And you have to keep in mind, it's not just practical knowledge, it's also practice, what the Sami herders do in making snow profiles. And it has a belief component. It is traditional knowledge, has a belief component, which for some scientists is problematic, right? Of course, they forget that science also has some hidden belief components, but we won't get into that. So indigenous knowledge can be, and sometimes is, dismissed by scientists, by governments, but increasingly accepted. Only about 20, 30 years ago, it really was dismissed by most scientists, not so much anymore. But you have to keep in mind that indigenous knowledge, there's some politics of knowledge here. There's some power imbalances between use of science by governments and use of indigenous knowledge by governments. So it's almost never a playing field, level playing field, as they say in American English. But there are ways around it. Okay, I showed you this figure earlier, but the point I want to make here is that we need to bridge knowledge systems. We can use them together, but don't try to mix them up. Indigenous knowledge is not data for science. It has its own logic, its own knowledge system. And you can't test one against the other. You cannot. Just as you can't test science by indigenous knowledge, you can't test indigenous knowledge by using science. So you have to respect the integrity of each way of knowing. I'm running out of time, am I not? Somebody's going to give me a 3-minute notice at some point, but sorry, who's the timekeeper? How much time do I have before the discussion? 5. Okay. Good. So we'll speed up a little bit, talk about adaptive governance. Okay. So this is about governance now. Governments really cannot deal with unpredictable events such as extreme weather events, which is what we have with climate change. Okay. So what can we do about it? Well, what we can do is called adaptive governance. Now, the basic concept is adaptive management, but governance is sort of the bigger angle of management. So management is action, governance is about the politics, about making decisions. And adaptive governance is important because by definition it takes uncertainty into account and is based on social learning, and that's what it looks like. I can't go through the whole cycle, but this is an adaptive management or adaptive governance cycle. It's based on learning by doing. How it works is you pose the problem, you pose the objective. You take certain actions to meet the objective and you monitor, and then you implement the actions and the monitoring. You analyze the results, and then you look for learning. You try to capture the learning. And when you do that, your task hasn't ended. You start it all over again, using that learning, and then you reconceptualize the problem, take your actions, monitor your findings, and go again. So it's a way of it's a way of going around the issue. If you can't really deal with the issue like unpredictability, then you do your first cut, the best you can do, learn from it, and then you do another cut. Now, this concept is actually not that novel. It's used in all areas of planning. It started probably with city planning, but all environmental planning uses this kind of thing. Like a national park has a 10-year plan where they do one cycle in 10 years. In Canada, it's 10 years. I don't know, Taiwan. And then you learn from it, you do another 10 years, and so on. Okay, so that's adaptive governance. AG. So think of it as an ongoing learning and negotiation process. it has no end point. It's cyclical. That doesn't mean you miss the point. If you do one cycle and it doesn't do you any good for your policy, well, that's okay. You just do another. You learn from it and move on. I mean, most policies, in fact, turn out to be wrong anyway, right? So the idea is you learn and you do it again. So the learning becomes important, that learning by doing. And then I'm going to touch it pretty quickly onto three things on what helps this learning by doing. One is sharing power and responsibility, also known as co-management. The other very effective tool is doing participatory research with the people affected. And the third is capacity development. So here's what it looks like. Quick Swedish case. This is a biosphere reserve south of Stockholm with an unpronounceable Swedish name. So it involves knowledge co-production with basically three clusters of people in that biosphere reserve. One cluster involved in water quality, one bird conservation, one about cultural heritage. It has a central office called Ecomuseum, EKV, and the EKV coordinates those groups, not everyone, but those groups which are, which are involved in, which are interested in solving ecosystem management problems. So it's iterative, it's collaborative, and it's feedback-based problem solving. And it's been really analyzed in some detail, so there's a literature on this for scholars who may be interested. The second point was participatory research. Participatory research does several things. It's really, really powerful. First of all, it helps communities improve their own understanding of environmental change. They are part of the research, they are partners, so they have a chance to reflect on the findings, and they can apply their own findings. They can apply their own learning from that research. This particular case refers to Uruguay. One of my PhD students, Michaela Trimble, was working with fishermen groups and government and managed to get the two parties to actually do research together. I said, Mika, you know, like you got maybe a 4-year PhD project, you'll never do it, and she did it. The third point is capacity development. This is, again, from another joint project of ours, this time from Brazil, Parachi area. The local fishers and boaters were negotiating with the parks department of the government. They didn't have the vocabulary and they didn't know how to get their points across. So we did workshops. There are all kinds of participatory techniques you can use for capacity development. To get them up to speed, to get them to put forward more effectively their points, and you know, basically get organized. Of course, when you do capacity development, you have to do it with the government people too, which is not so easy actually. But you know, it takes two partners to do a partnership. Okay, so that takes us into. I'm on time. Two conclusions. So the first one is about resilience building, learning, adaptive management. We can do it. We can do this. We have been doing this. So it's not that mysterious. There are ways of looking at it. There are ways of doing it. It's not going to solve your problem in one shot. But there are many kinds of approaches where we can learn from the local knowledge, and do something positive with it. Social learning becomes really important from disaster shocks. In fact, I'm working on a project for the first time on that, on how learning can help with disaster shocks. And I hope to collaborate with some of your scholars here. Intermediary organizations have an important role to play. Universities, NGOs, We do things different from governments and indigenous peoples, but we try to understand both. So that's really important. What do? We can help bridge different kinds of knowledge. We can help develop capacity. We can assist the parties communicate with one another. We can support local institutions. And we can foster social learning. The second conclusion is about adaptive governance. I'm less sure about this because I'm not in governance myself, but I think this is really important for decision makers and people in government. Oren Yang, my senior colleague who is an expert in governance, points out that the conventional ways of doing regulation, environmental regulation and governance, no longer works well. We got too much change happening, and not just climate change either. Globalization, all kinds of global change happening. So we need to look at different ways of doing it, such as learning, making adaptive governance dynamic. In other words, faster response time to changes. To quote Oren Yang from a recent paper, governing complex systems calls for a willingness to experiment with innovative practices in the face of uncertainty. And that's a very different kind of governance, Oren Yang points out. So it requires participatory approaches, collaborative approaches. We need to combine different kinds of knowledge. We need to do some learning, not individual learning. Remember, we're talking about learning as society. We're talking about learning as institutions, social learning. And we need multiple voices to generate those innovative practices. Thank you. 谢谢。
Reindeer 教授呢，今天事实上是对我们整个今天大会的一个演讲主题的一个破题针对这个ILK 原住民在地知识，它对韧性的这个建构还有所谓的 adaptive governance， 应该正确的翻译应该是调适性治理和适应性的治理这几个重点做了一个分析。他举了全球性的一个例子刚刚读学台湾有我们在座的很多的杰出的研究者，赶快把你们的研究这个能够发表让他们知道台湾其实不是空白的但是在他的资料上，台湾是空白，他知道台湾在哪里，但是没有例子。那么举了秘鲁的这个马铃薯的公园和9000公顷，有1300多种的这个马铃薯那种智慧，还有玻利维亚的这个安第斯的因为气候变迁，它的耕作区的这个扩张，以及萨米的这个游牧，它的智慧，它对雪的词汇还多过这个以诺伊。我记得以诺伊，我们在跟戴文宇教授到格陵兰的时候，他们跟我们讲他的有关于冰跟雪的这个用词，将近100个那我们中文你想想看，我们大概只有2个，冰雪还有什么非常丰富的这个在地知识我想他的所建构的这个论述可以说是全球性的，但也在地，也是在地性那接下来请各位尽量发言。各位的英文可能比我好，就直接用英文翻译，请。
Professor Point. Yes, sir, thank you so much for the very inspiring speech. And you mentioned that scientists should not test religious knowledge because it is not a data for scientific analysis, and vice versa. So, because they have different logic. I think it's very important reminding, but at the same time, how do we dialogue with each other if we cannot test each other.
Maybe one or more question corrected? 有没有？好，我们再收集一个或两个，我们等一下请他。如果来。
讲中文好了，有口音。你好，我想请问的是有一页是关于那个大学的责任哈，就是大学如何可以跟社区一起合作，来促进社区的 capability building。那我比较疑惑的是，社区没有办法自己做这个嘛？他们本身自己应该是有能力来完成自己的训练。那大学介入的要点跟特色在哪里？是部落自己本身没有办法做到的。
Can you get it? She saw a page. There's a mention about the university responsibility and participating to help the community to build a capacity. So, yes, she asked if you wonder the community themselves can do it themselves. What do really the university's role in this?
Two questions.
Two questions. 还有没有这里。
Oh yes, and my question is, you mentioned a case in Brazil where the fishermen in the village didn't have the exact communication skills or even the keyword to communicate with the responsible agencies. My question is, how do a research team, how can they come in and actually collaborate in this participatory collaboration? And does the research team have a gap in communicating, since they are the fishermen, they have the gap, right?
Yeah. Okay. I'll start with the first question, Dr. Daya's question. Yeah. Of course, he probably knows the answer because he's been working in that area. There are certain kinds of knowledge that can be tested. You know, does millet grow at 2,000 meters, let's say? Scientists will have something to say about that, and the indigenous farmers will have something to say about that. But there are other kinds of knowledge that, in terms of practice, which may be related to rituals and so on, it gets more complicated, and it really can't be tested. And then there are certain kinds of indigenous knowledge that really shouldn't be questioned about anyway, like sacred sites. We were working with some Ojibwa people, and we said, we want to know about plant knowledge, but we're not going to ask you about sacred plants, sacred practices. And this went for a while, the research went for a while, and then after a while they said, you know, we have to tell you about some of the sacred practices because otherwise you can't understand the rest of it. In terms of testing knowledge, think, if you're an economist, can you test ecological knowledge? Or if you're an ecologist, can you test somebody's economics knowledge? It's similar to that. It's coming from different roots, but in the case of indigenous knowledge, it's even more difficult because it's a different worldview that it's coming from. So, some indigenous knowledge doesn't hold up to scientific inquiry, but then some scientific knowledge doesn't hold up to indigenous ways of thinking. So it's more complicated than the way I put it. But yeah, I mean, basically, you don't use one system of knowledge to test another. That's the basic idea. The capacity building issue. Development people used to say, okay, we're going to develop capacity. You people are ignorant, we're going to teach you. That idea has changed over the years. So we've gone from the glass half empty approach to the glass half full approach. So you start with the abilities and the capacities of the group you're working with, and you build on those strengths. That's, I'm not a specialist in development studies, but that's the basic idea. And how do you work with those fishermen? Well, they have to invite you. You have to have a working relationship. You have to have trust. And they say, well, come and help us so we can talk to the national parks people, because they talk and we don't understand the thing they're saying. And that's so common, right? But if they don't invite you, you don't, as researchers, you don't impose yourself on them. And why would you do it? Well, I don't know. Maybe you're doing a thesis, or maybe it's just your social responsibility as university people.
最后两位，那边一位，还有那边一位，有麦克风吗？
Thank you for this talk. I'm Deja Feng from National Taiwan Museum, and I'm really interested in indigenous knowledge, especially recently considering even to be noticed in our exhibitions. But there is one thing I'm curious. While working with indigenous communities, because there are communities that have been exploited by colonizations, so does your work involve, for example, trauma sessions to consult them? I'm curious about that. Is there any additional work you have to do before you study their knowledge?
好，谢谢。
Hello, Professor Berkis. I'm from Taiwan University Institute Program of Climate Change and Sustainable Development. And my question is kind of similar to the first question about the different systems of knowledge. And you just mentioned one very important point is it's very difficult to use one system of knowledge to test another system of knowledge. And so I would like to ask, like, we are doing a lot of transdisciplinary approaches nowadays, like people trying to use environmental economics and some different new discipline of the knowledge. So how do we know that, like, in what kind of situation we need to try to combine them, or we try to understand that they cannot be combined, because you mentioned in the documents that the knowledge, traditional knowledge, and the modern science knowledge cannot be mixed. They can only be bridged. So how do we distinguish the two? Thank
you. Yes, thank you. I'm not getting any easy questions here. and how much time we have? We only have less than 3 minutes. So, working with indigenous knowledge holders, what we often do is we have some questions as university scholars, and they have some questions as indigenous people. We meet, we find common ground. They're not interested in academic questions, but some of our academic questions are of interest to them. So we try to find those questions which are good for them, good for us, and we can work together. It can get formal. You can sign research agreements, and more universities do that in Canada. If it's a big project, especially, basically you sign research agreements. New Zealanders started that. Henrik Muller and team at Otago, working with the Maori, were signing agreements back in the 90s. Now it's become very common. But the basic idea is you find those common interests. You want to work with them, and they will help you, and you work together. The research is partnerships. The indigenous people are not your subjects, they are your partners. So that's the most important principle there. Combining knowledge. Second question. I know Professor Kahete would be talking about some of that. But briefly, I would say, yeah, you're bridging knowledge, all right. But that means also bridging the questions you ask, interpreting the results together. That early climate change studies we did, boy, we didn't know what was going on. So we, in fact, had to work with the indigenous knowledge holders to figure out what was happening with climate change. You know, we're talking about 1990. That's not 20 years, that's 30 years. And then what to do with that knowledge. So the bridging also means partnership and working with indigenous people. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Now, the previous session is on global perspective. Now, this session we go into more smaller scale, which is a regional perspective. And we have two distinguished speakers to share with us about how particular area or particular ethnic groups, their local knowledge has a lot to do with how they manage the environment, how they survive in a particular ecological situation. I recall 10, 15 years ago when I noticed that as a sociologist, oh, by the way, I'm a sociologist as well, not just a chairman of something, or advisor to someone. I have been noticing that in the east coast of Taiwan, we have 4 ethnic groups: Milanese, Hokkien, Fulau, Hakka, Mainlanders, the Austronesian tribes, and plus now we have number 5th ethnic groups from Southeast Asia, the new residents. And of course, new resident is much new, and they have to adapt to established environment. How the formal ethnic groups manage and survive in the particular ecological situation deserve sociological and anthropological attention. So I told our lay friend Ji Junjie and our friend Wang Junxiu, both are sociologists, you should pay attention to them, how they share one specific ecological situation and they live peacefully. Because East Coast is the microscopic picture of Taiwan, multi-ethnic, diverse society. And they live peacefully and they share the river, they share the mountain, they share the soil, and they share the hazard, and they share the crisis. How do they do that? How did they do that? For centuries. So I think in a ethnic diverse society like Taiwan, the local knowledge, regardless of which ethnic group's locality means, it really means a lot. And then as a current resident of Taiwan, we should learn from the past how they experience the hazard and how they manage and how they survive. So I'm sure in this conference, this is very timing. The conference should pay also attention to our local knowledge. That means Taiwan. But today's session we have 2 very good speakers. One is new friend, the other is an old friend, not in age, just senior friend, old buddy. And so the climate change, indigenous resilience, and local knowledge system, regional perspective. And I do want to go into very detail about who they are, what they have done, what they have achieved. You can see their respective biodata in page 62 and 63. But I'm happy to mention briefly, our first speaker is Professor Rita Toivainen. She is a professor of Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science. I remember this term has been coined for about a decade, right? About a decade, sustainability science. And University of Helsinki, Finland. And her topic is Indigenous Sami Voices and Resilience in the Arctic region. And this is a very unique ethnic group spread in Norway, Finland, I heard even Sweden. And she will talk about that topic. And the second speaker, since I have to introduce them and I will step down. Professor Gerald Persoon, and he is an old friend. And Rita is a new friend. And this old friend is a professor emeritus of Environment and Development, Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at the Leiden University, the Netherlands. And he will speak. The title is long. It's called Knowledge and Practice of Indigenous Peoples in the Context of Climate Changes and Natural Resources Management in some Southeast Asian islands. And just for the commercial purposes, my foundation, Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, is devoted to promote Taiwan relations with Southeast Asia and South Asia. So I think environmental management, indigenous people, and they told me time is up for me. The time is just begin for them. So that's what we will hope to can. Environment is part of our concern as well. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Rita Toivainen.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and I see that we have an excellent audience here, so I'm expecting to have great exchanges with you after the talk, and then of course during the breaks, and hopefully coming days you are always welcome to contact me if there is anything that you found especially interesting or disturbing in this presentation. So, who are the Arctic indigenous peoples? Altogether, around 4 million people live in the Arctic area, and there are only 10% of them belong to some of the indigenous populations in the area. So there are 40 different peoples living in the Arctic. Apart from the Sami, who live in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia, as we just heard, there are also Nenets and Khanty and Evenki in Russia, for example, Inuit in Canada, Inuit, Kalaaleet on Greenland, and Inuit, Inuapit, Aluet, and Yupik in Alaska, and some other indigenous peoples in the region. I wanted to start with saying that what is a bit different with the Arctic indigenous peoples in comparison with, for example, indigenous peoples in Latin America, or with some Indian groups in North America. Whereas, for example, in Panama, one day the vessels, or Spanish vessels, arrived, and in just 2 decades, most of the indigenous peoples were dead because of diseases or violence. In the Arctic, that has not been the case. It has been a place of kind of interaction with very different peoples for a long time. The Arctic region in the Nordic countries, for example, their archaeological and historical linguistic investigations show that they have been a very multicultural and multilingual communities for hundreds and hundreds of years. So new people have arrived and partly acquired the livelihoods of the people who were already there, and then people who were there have maybe changed to other professions of maybe small-scale agriculture. So the colonialization story is different, but it doesn't say that it wouldn't be as brutal in many ways, because it has been a colonialization of minds, and this is still continuing today, as I will show. The Sami are the only recognized indigenous peoples in the European Union. I'm not saying in Europe, because then we will have to enter the discussion of where is Europe, but in the European Union. And their homelands are located in Lapland, in the northernmost part of Europe, as I said, in these 4 countries. There are about 45,000 Norwegian Sami or Sami who live in Norway, about 16 to 20,000 in Sweden, about 10,000 in Finland, and 2,000 in Russia, mainly in the Polar Peninsula. These numbers are, of course, political, so there are no definite census. We don't really know how many people are there, but we have the understanding that the numbers are growing. And this has to do with the fact that the Sami are now recognized as indigenous peoples in all of these countries. And this kind of raising recognition also is tied to a certain more positive understanding of identity. There are 9 different languages spoken today. Some of them have just recently died, so there is no reason that they wouldn't be revitalized maybe one day if there are enough people who start with those efforts. But Northern Sami is called the lingua franca. That means that it's the most spoken and most used language as it's used in Norway, Sweden and Finland, Northern Sami. But even in their traditional homelands, the Sami people are nowadays a minority, almost in all municipalities. In all of the Nordic countries, they have a political representative body, the Sami Parliament, which is elected every 4 years among the Sami themselves. And these are the counterpartners to speak with the respective governments in each country. In Russia, the Sami Parliament is still an NGO and not the nationally financed body. Still today, very many stereotypical depictions of the Sami are widespread. And they include ideas of nature people as exotic and mystic. The Sami are often depicted as northern people of nature, ancient and traditional, as opposed to binaries of culture and modernity. This has in many instances placed the Sami on the outside of culture and politics of states and as a people who have no agency of their own. Because nature doesn't do politics. It just goes its own natural course. Scholars have subsequently suggested that this imaginary of Arctic and its peoples could be also called Arcticism in a similar manner as Edward Said's famous account on Orientalism. The Nordic states have also in their part managed to create an international image of benign caretakers of the Sami. The Sami history is presented in a manner in which Sami people are always depicted as nature people who depend on the kindness of Nordic states. This is a very old picture drawn by Olaus Magnus, trying to, in 1539, trying to show how the Arctic in the Barents Sea area looks like. So you can see that it's definitely not the periphery. There is a lot traffic going on, a lot of churches, vessels that are bringing goods. There is a lot of business ongoing. This shows that if you look from this side, this part of on the map, it is a very central place, and historically it has been a very central place of business and cultural interaction. Still, even though the North was earlier in European, I want to say that up until 1960s, still also the academic interest in the Sami and as an indigenous peoples has been very much on methodologies, religions, and kind of ways of life and so on, languages, human-animal relations. And only recently has there been a growing interest in the kind of political agency of Sami people and from their own perspective, and also on the more nuanced histories. of the cultural meetings and local politics that have taken place all these centuries. So even to the north was earlier in European history described by adventurers and scientists and imagined as sublime and dangerous place. It was also seen as a cornucopia, as a kind of horn of plenty and as a resource frontier. And this map shows it quite clearly, this kind of the richnesses that are waiting there. We just have access to the area. We will get gold and we will get diamonds and we will get richnesses. And I think this imaginary is still one part of the binary fantasy on the Arctic. The Arctic is an increasing interest to extractive industries. Forest, water, minerals, oil, gas, and vegetation are all of high economic value and much wanted by governments and transnational companies. Due to exploitation, large areas traditionally occupied by the indigenous peoples have turned into useless wastelands. The waters have been dammed and polluted, forests have been cut, and mines have forced people to move away from their traditional sites or homes. This picture is made by a Sami artist collective, so that we don't know who the artist is, but it's a group of artists who are kind of commenting on the current state of affairs in the Nordic countries by using art as a means of activism. And this is how they see what's going on in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia at the moment. So there are a lot of stereotypic pictures of unethical tourism, extractive industries, all kind of interest, destroying of the nature, and just not caring, being ignorant towards the people's own way of life and their own wishes. So private global actors are increasingly present on state lands, prompting some authors to speak about incoming or already ongoing land rush. The effects of extractive industries raise concerns for the harm they cause to Arctic environments and local lands and communities. The local indigenous cultures and livelihoods, namely fishing, hunting, gathering, reindeer herding, and increasingly, of course, also tourism, are highly dependent on land, and it goes without saying that the contemporary extractive activities are a great threat to them today. So Stamler and Ivanova have used the concept of utilitarian logic, a discursive frame in which natural environments are seen as only of instrumental value for humans to use for resources. This is a common discourse for international extractive enterprises and states alike, also in the case of Finnish Lapland and the Arctic. This approach has been part of the modern state politics and often found dichotomous to indigenous cosmologies. Today there is an ongoing discursive change regarding the need to preserve the natural environment and use nature sustainably. Globally and in Finland, indigenous peoples have gained a central function in this discourse. Nature has come to provide an aspect in the political identity projects of indigenous peoples. In the fight for rights to their lands, being a people of nature provides them, as they say, a greater moral right than others to use their traditional lands. This discursive function has also been utilized by environmental movements. For example, Greenpeace has often collaborated with Sami and other indigenous peoples in their fight against extractive industries in the Arctic areas. In the global discourse, the Sami, along with other indigenous peoples, have gained a special role as having knowledge of sustainable use of nature. The dichotomy of the colonizing state and economic market powers on the one hand and indigenous peoples on the other hand is, however, inherently more complex, particularly with regard to the actual local experiences of extractive projects. As many researchers point out, extractive industries often include hope for economic prosperity and jobs in the Arctic area, where the economic situation is often critical. For example, in Finnish Lapland, the unemployment rate is over 13%, whereas the average in other parts of the country is only 6%. And in some villages in Finnish Lapland, the unemployment rate can be about 30%, so really high. Then you do understand that when there is speaking of a new mine or other project, there are very mixed feelings towards them. One see hope for jobs and income, and others fear what it brings with it. Furthermore, sustainable use of nature has gained a value also in this utilitarian discourse. Some researchers have pointed out that the untouched nature is also seen as having an economic value today. Nature tourism and also nature livelihoods such as fishing and reindeer herding are a big part of the economic viability of many communities in Lapland today, both for Sami but also for the non-Sami inhabitants. Many researchers point out that sustainable use of forest is even believed to create more jobs than extractive industries. Thus, a straightforward dichotomy of sustainability versus economic profit, or indigenous peoples versus extractive industries, is very difficult to uphold. The success of adopting a utilitarian versus a nature people approach when opposing state and enterprise extractivism diverges. Stamler and Ivanova, I mentioned them earlier on the utilitarian logic, found in their study of Arctic local populations that those who managed to make the best deals for themselves when extractive industry entered their lands had used this utilitarian logic themselves. So they had, in a way, spoken in the same language. On the other hand, cases from Finland show that in collaboration with international organizations such as the mentioned Greenpeace, Sami communities have managed to put international pressure on industry that want to save their reputation, given that the nature conservation and sustainability are highly valued norms today. However, being labeled as traditional nature people causes further difficulties to include contemporary ways of conducting Sami livelihoods. For example, Sami have been criticized for using the modern snowmobiles and other modern technology, and they have been asked that if you are traditional indigenous peoples, you shouldn't use any modern equipment, that would be somehow contrasting. Indigenous people's ways of life are not a historical curiosity, and already in 1992, the United Nations Human Rights Committee confirmed in its case on Landsman against Finland that traditionality and modernity in indigenous livelihoods are reconcilable. Their livelihoods are strongly connected to the vitality of their cultures, to their well-being today, and to their survival in modern world. After all, the subject matter of debate circles around livelihoods which have adapted to strongly changing environments and which have, in a way, survived until the present through waves and by the help of modernization. Indigenous peoples' rights took form slowly in the post-Second World War period, and until during the 1960s, indigenous movements all around the world started to unite, as it well described in a book by Saul, for example. The Nordic Sami Council was established already in 1956, and it participated very strongly in establishing the indigenous permanent forum for indigenous issues at the United Nations. At the same time, in international law, the legal category indigenous peoples took form and became the core of legal protection for indigenous peoples all around the world. The definition of the category and the answer to the question, who is indigenous, is, however, frequently still debated. The internationally rather widely acknowledged criteria include that the indigenous people must have lived in the area before the state was established, have maintained a specific way of life, social structure, livelihoods, habits and traditions, culture and languages distinct to the majority population. The moral basis for granting these special differentiated rights is, however, that all peoples that call themselves indigenous people have suffered under political circumstances during which their right to development on their own has been denied. And at the same time, their cultures, languages, religion, belief system, livelihoods and spaces for livelihoods have been destroyed on behalf of religious missionaries, state geopolitics, military interventions, wars, last but not least, extractive industries. Indigenous peoples have consequently gained leverage in their claims for their land. Extractive industries are themselves becoming more ethically informed, also when it comes to the rights of local communities and indigenous peoples. The Arctic Council has played a central role in the process in the Arctic area. And there are several international legal frameworks that provide for the right of indigenous peoples to maintain and foster their culture. In Europe, for example, the European Union's Commission and the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, they have in their proposal regarding future further development of the European Union's policy towards the Arctic state said, I'm quoting, "The European Union is ready to work with the Arctic state, indigenous peoples and relevant Arctic regional and multilateral fora to share experience, expertise and information on climate change, impacts, adaptations and resilience." And I think it's quite remarkable that the indigenous peoples are here really for the first time mentioned as a kind of partner and not just a kind of object towards whom there needs to be worked. There are also the United Nations ACWECO guidelines for the conduct of that are part of the Convention of the Biological Diversity, and these require from the kind of states that they need to take the indigenous perspective on economic and development very seriously. They have to build partnerships, and there should be always a prior consent on the indigenous peoples if any kind of activities such as extractive industries are brought to their lands. And for example, the Finnish state-owned company, forest company Metsähallitus, has 2013 decided that they will follow these ACWECO guidelines, but only in the, strictly speaking, Sami home territory, nowhere else. And that means that they are committed that if they have any activities in this Sami home territory, they always have a consultation process. This structural power imbalance has helped to keep the Sami movement at the periphery of modern politics and entrusted the Sami Parliament with cultural but no economic or substantial political autonomy. Thus, the role of the Nordic states in producing a canon of Sami history has been a double-edged. The Finnish government has stressed very much the way how harmoniously Sami people live and how they are nature people and how environmental they are, but at the same time that has meant that they have ripped off their own agency and their own visions for future and their own political will. But are Sami heard by the government today? From the perspective of international human rights law, it is without any doubt clear that the developments of the Arctic should take place according to the wishes and needs of the local and indigenous peoples. But is this actually the case? Based on the recent research that I have carried out in the Arctic area in Finland, Norway and Russia, there was also a survey that was asking the local people how they trust their governments to understand their local situations. And it was so about 5% of the respondents said that somebody in Oslo, in Stockholm, Helsinki or Moscow does understand what's going on in their home village. So there is not much trust. We were talking about the trust building here this morning. So at least here it seems that there is a lot of work to be done if trust is to be gained. So the typical answer was that the members of parliament, they are not interested and they don't even know that we exist actually. Because from the perspective of South, it looks like we would live in the periphery even too. That's obviously not true as I showed earlier. So there are all kind of plans by the government and by the kind of consulting companies what would be the future of the Arctic area. And here is, for example, a map that suddenly came from a consultancy company. Of course, it was paid by the Finnish and Norwegian and Swedish governments. A plan to have a railroad crossing the Sami Reindeer Herding area. And if this would happen, it would basically mean the end of reindeer herding in the whole area, because the reindeers wouldn't learn to watch out when they cross the rails. So this is part of the kind of what's going on in the Arctic in Finland, but I think Finland is just one case. It applies to the other countries, unfortunately, very well too. That there are all the time kind of governmental and business plans, what could be done in this resource frontier, the cornucopia, what can we take from there and how could we have access to this. But the people who live there become kind of not interesting, and they are just an obstacle that has to be removed so that projects can be carried on. And at the same time, there is a very strongly growing understanding that the indigenous knowledges should be taken seriously, that the sustainability is, we cannot reach it without an understanding of kind of working together. So there are kind of a lot of contracting ideologies, I would say, ongoing. So in the recent years, many reports have come about that have discussed the plans for future in the Arctic area, especially in this Barents Sea area, and all of them kind of stress this, that we just have to find the way how we can do it, and we have to collaborate, we governments. And then the indigenous Sami people are maybe mentioned in one sentence that says that, oh, their wishes need to be taken into account, or we should also talk with the Sami people on this. So here are three of the kind of reports that none of them takes into account the Sami people, but are totally making plans for the indigenous area of Lapland. So at the same time, when the indigenous movement has been becoming stronger, and due to this kind of climate crisis, in many fora we discuss the fact that the indigenous voices are one key for in fight for climate change or adaptation to climate change. At the same time, at least in the Arctic area, in the Barents Sea, the Nordic countries, there are these plans that are just in contradiction to all this kind of talk about preserving nature, saving planet. And the indigenous Sami people have gained leverage, so they are not anymore alone. There are a lot of partnerships, there are places where they can talk. There are also legal instruments which they can use against their governments together with other indigenous peoples, and they definitely do that. But when we at the moment talk about the question that whose development is at stake here, it seems that from the perspective of governments, it is still the question of development of a state and less the development of the indigenous peoples. So I'm not saying that there is no hope, but I'm just saying that we really have to be alerted in a way how there is a kind of discussion and planning ongoing beneath the surface. This doesn't come up much in the newspapers. And these plans, like the Arctic Railway, they just suddenly come up from somewhere. And the Sami Parliament, who always should be the partner in all the planning, hasn't even been consulted on that. So maybe I finish here because my time is up. That's a good place to finish. And thank you for your listening. And I'm really appreciating all your questions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to have been invited to this audience and here to speak at the conference. I've been to Taiwan quite a number of times. As Michael said, we are old friends, and it's great to see people who I've met earlier. I also apologize for the horrible title, but that was when I speak about indigenous peoples and climate change, you cannot but refrain from resource management, because to isolate climate change from other impacts on resource management is quite complicated, as I hope to show. This is what I want to do. First, a few remarks about indigenous peoples when I say Southeast Asia, insular Southeast Asia. I talk about the Philippines and Indonesia. Most of them live in lowland forests, but in addition to what indigenous peoples are doing there are all kinds of other forms of land use that do have an impact on the way these indigenous people actually operate there. A few remarks about climate change as taken from the major reports, and then I will move over to 4 case studies that we have been interested in, that has been the topic of research of local students from Indonesia and the Philippines, and with master students and a couple of my colleagues have been working on these issues for quite a number of years, and I will conclude, of course, with a couple of more general remarks. Looking at what we see in terms of indigenous peoples in the lowland rainforest, you will find an enormous variety of modes of existence, of modes of livelihood. We still have in some areas what anthropologists always call the hunters and gatherers, a very basic lifestyle without domestication of crops and plants. Shifting cultivation is much better known and much more widespread in the area, and often in combination with partial shifting cultivation and partial permanent agriculture. That is a sort of lifestyle of many of these indigenous peoples. I should also, of course, mention fishing as a major issue of livelihood, even in the rainforest with the extensive rivers and also the people living along the coast. Fishing usually contributes most of the protein that these people are consuming. By now, none of these indigenous peoples are fully live on subsistence, hunting and gathering, or agriculture. All of them, one way or the other, are involved in commercialization of particular type of crops. And this could be the so-called non-timber forest products like rattan, in some cases bushmeat, raisins, and all kinds of other products that can be harvested from the forest. But quite a number of them also do cultivate cash crops, like rubber, like copra, like gloves, like a couple of other things that contribute to their need for cash. In addition to what the indigenous people are doing, you will find in all the lowland forests in Southeast Asia, on the first place, expanding agricultural area by migrants from other groups, people that have been expelled for various reasons and who are looking for arable land in what is generally being still considered the empty land, and that is where the indigenous peoples are living. Large-scale logging is, of course, a well-known phenomenon from the Philippines, Indonesia, and many other countries. And I don't know whether you have peat swamp forest in Taiwan. I don't think so, but this is a major issue in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and on Sumatra and Borneo in particular, where peat swamp forests are being drained. And this has a major impact on the type of landscape that you're going to have. Mining operations in Indonesia, you also have large-scale transmigration, through which Javanese and Balinese and other people are sort of translocated to the outer areas, very often in areas where the indigenous peoples are living. Infrastructural development, hydro power dams in some cases, or other sort of construction of highways is also threatening and encroaching in the territory of the indigenous peoples. As a result of that, you will get a highly diversified. What do I do wrong? Oh, sorry. Now, in terms of climate change, if we read the reports by the IPCC and also the global climate models, in general, it is agreed that there will be an increase in temperature. It is also predicted that there will be longer and drier periods in most of these areas. In terms of rainfall, the picture is quite diverse. Some areas are expected to have more rain. Other areas in Sumatra, for instance, are expected to have lower rain. So it's quite a diverse image what we see here. In terms of sea level rise, this is of course important for many of the mangrove areas and the really lowland areas. These will be subject to inundation. And in particular, as you also experience, of course, here in Taiwan, there will be more and even stronger typhoons. Fortunately, Indonesia is rarely hit by these kinds of hazards. The impact of all these things is, of course, damage to agriculture, water shortage, coastal erosion, in combination often with logging, and risk of flooding. Now, overlooking both climate change and these new forms of human activities, in general, you can see a massive decline of forest cover throughout the area, including also the loss of biodiversity. And very important in relation to the peat swamp forest, as the water is being drained and the peat gradually sort of decomposes, the land is subsiding, so the land is sinking in these areas, and this is very crucial for the type of vegetation and the type of wildlife that you are likely to have. And what you also find in Malaysia and Indonesia, if you take out the water from the peat swamps, you get fuel. And these extensive forest fires have all to do with the drainage of the water from these type of forests. So increased risk of forest and peatland fires is one of the combinations of climate change as well as the human activity of draining the water from these forests. Now, the four cases I would like to discuss shortly is here the Acta in the Philippines. Then we move to the Orang Rimba in central Sumatra, then the Mentawaians and the Ngaju Dayak here in the southern part of central Kalimantan. First, the Acta in the Philippines, and these are the truly indigenous peoples of the Philippines before the Austronesians came. The American ethnographers used to call them the Negrito type of people because they have very curly hair, very dark, very small. They are originally hunters and gatherers, and they live off fishing, and they live along the coastline of the Pacific and in the lower parts of the watersheds. living along the coast, living in good quality forests, allowed them for a very diverse type of food. The type of resources was really enormous. They could hunt, they could fish, they would also commercially collect bird nests from the caves. And if you would make an inventory, as we have done with a couple of PhD students, what people actually eat, it is an enormous diversity, and both men, women and children contribute to that menu. But they also face all kinds of challenges from outside. There is commercial logging, there are the encroaching farmers, because the Philippines is a highly densely populated area. Many farmers are looking for arable land elsewhere. It's mining, and also the missionary activities, and I mentioned these a couple of times, because missionaries have played a key role in sort of changing worldviews on beliefs in environmental issues, and that's why they are important. And the Philippines, in this area, has also faced the guerrilla activities of the New People's Army. Now, the ACTA have been coping with these challenges. On the one hand, they have moved from hunters and gatherers to sort of simple forms of agriculture. But maybe more interestingly, they have developed a kind of symbiosis with the neighboring farmers. On the one hand, they hunt in their fields, but they also provide labor for the farmers who do not avail of sufficient workforce. But they also, having been faced with logging and mining companies, they do accept also activities for these companies. And being relatively small in numbers, weak in power, there has hardly ever been any resistance that we know of more powerful and more numerous indigenous peoples. And nowadays you can also see ACTA people operating chainsaws and working for these companies, something that they would explain as we simply don't have other options. Now it's interesting to see how the ACTA are coping with typhoons, because they have been coping with typhoons, you know, for millennia, and they have very simple forms of coping with that. They are extremely mobile. Their housing forms are extremely flexible, and they could read the weather conditions and the ocean conditions, and they would simply move away from where the big dangers are. And they have never relied on disaster relief from governmental agencies or NGOs. And this is the form of housing that these people have. It's relatively simple lean-tos. If they would have to move to elsewhere, they would simply leave their little huts, because this is not a big investment. They would build something else, or they would take it even with them over short distances. And the flexibility and high mobility is their way of coping with this type of disaster. And very soon afterwards, they would have access again to the marine resources, and also in the forest they would go out for hunting and others. So they would never suffer from hunger compared to, for instance, with farmers who see their total crops being destroyed. The Orang Rimba of Jambi, central Sumatra, are a comparable type of hunter-gatherers, also very small bands of people, and they, like the ACTA, also have a very diversified modes of livelihood. They are exchanging various non-timber forest products, like julutu, which is used for chewing gum, rattan, honey, bushmeat for some people, and nowadays, and they would get tobacco, ironware, and other things in return. Being non-Muslims, having a lifestyle very different from what's being called the Malay population, they have always kept a distance between the two. They never want to assimilate with the Malay people. This is now a picture of the province of Jambi. Probably you cannot read what is written there, but this is to indicate the highly diverse landscape that you have. You have some protected areas, and apart from that you have plantations, you have transmigration sites, and it is no longer an extensive rainforest compared to what it was. These are some pictures of what the people do for a living. This is the main staple crop, Dioscorea species. They hunt primates. This is a very sort of lead to a very simple hut. It isn't much like a house, but it makes them very mobile. They do not invest in big housing. This is other crops, and this is a gelatum tree, which is being tapped for to be sold to external farmers, for which they get tobacco and other things in return. Apparently, I do something very wrong.
Nothing. It's okay.
Okay. Challenges from outside: large-scale logging, plantations, transmigration, road construction and development. And logging, well, it looks the same wherever you are in tropical rainforest areas. This is how the Orang Rimba usually face mining or logging companies. They cannot resist, they cannot do anything about it. They simply have to adjust and cope with it and cope with the changes in the environment as caused by these logging companies. This is what a newly cleared plantation area looks like for palm oil. There isn't much to do for the Orang Rimba in terms of hunting and collecting. And finally, the Indonesian government wants to civilize its primitive population, and it's building these kind of resettlement houses, which the Orang Rimba do not like. Interestingly, the Orang Rimba have developed a kind of symbiosis with the Malay farmers. As I said, they don't want to integrate into the Malay community, but they have developed a kind of cooperation with the Malay farmers in the sense that they hunt the wild animals in the gardens of the Malay farmers, and the Malay farmers call these wild boar, deer, tapir, monkeys, basically as pests, because they eat their crops. And the Orang Rimba profit from the agricultural activities by the attraction that these crops have for the animals. It makes hunting much easier. And just like the Akta, they also do some paid labor for the Malay farmers. Some recent developments, their way of coping is also now investing in agriculture. Fortunately, to some extent, people are also getting now a kind of protection in national parks. They can actually live in national parks and they are not being expelled. But in general, they have greatly modified their way of hunting and gathering and adjustment compared to what it used to be. Now, already in the colonial times, when the Dutch were governing these areas, it was predicted that the Orang Rimba would go extinct within 30, 40, 50 years. One could not imagine that a lifestyle like this could be continued in the long run. But the resilience, to refer to the first speaker of today, of these Orang Rimba has been very remarkable. They are really strong survivors. And yes, they have not gone extinct. They have modified their lifestyle. They have changed in many ways, but they have not completely assimilated into their neighboring communities. And surprisingly, in some of the protected areas, they survive pretty much like the way their ancestors used to live. And here you see a picture of the Indonesian president, Jokowi, who was the first president of the country to visit these people. And he actually promised them some kind of protection. And in as far as it doesn't work, also the Orang Rimba, they adjust. And they also like to have a mobile phone and a motorbike, etc. But these are sort of adjustments, not on their way to total assimilation into the neighboring communities. The third case is a case where I have spent quite a number of years in my earlier sort of career. It's about the Mentawaians of the west coast of Sumatra. This is Sumatra. Here is a chain of islands, and the largest island of this is called Siberut. dense rainforest, small clans were living there, a subsistence economy based on sago, a palm tree that provides lots of starch, semi-domesticated pigs and chickens, and all kinds of other useful products. Very sort of rich environment, and in terms of food, everything was abundant. People never suffered from hunger in that area, and that was the basis of what people used to call a very rich material culture with all kinds of elaborate rituals. Here you see these semi-domestic pigs, chickens. People lived in long houses. This is the production of sago starch, which is a very easy product to produce. With a little amount of labor, you can have quite a large harvest. And it is a medicine man collecting various medicinal plants. And the Mentawaians are known for their elaborate rituals. Now, challenges from outside is again missionary activities. In Indonesia, there was a law that forbid any animistic or traditional beliefs. You had to believe in one God, either Christianity or Islam as the major religions. Logging has been on the island, and again, just like with the Orang Rimba, resettlement and development. And recently, tourism has discovered this island, because Western backpackers would love to see a Stone Age culture, as it's usually being labeled. And it is also a fantastic area for surfing. The development issue is also, it can be seen in sort of the transition from eating sago to rice, because for modern Indonesians, sago eating is like a sort of primitive food. It's also being eaten by pigs and by chickens, and humans should eat rice. But in terms of environmental issues, in terms of economic issues, it is much more difficult to cultivate rice, to fight against rats and birds and monkeys and what have you, while sago doesn't have all these negative aspects. It is a great crop in that kind of terms. Modernization also comes in the form of modern schooling, of course, and modern religion. In terms of climate change, of course, things are also changing on Siberut and in Mentawai. But the biggest issue here is natural hazards. The islands off the west coast of Sumatra are on a shelf that is slowly moving underneath the major shelf of Sumatra. And all the earthquakes that you have in this area, like the big tsunami earthquake in 2004, are part of this gradual geological movement. And people don't realize this themselves, because they have to be told by geologists, but a major new disaster is most likely to come. The resilience for these kind of things is, of course, relatively easy in terms of available resources, because population density is still very low. It is more than 4,000 square kilometers for only 30,000 people. With sago and fish and all the other crops, people will not be hungry. Their traditional agriculture, be it the wooden longhouses, are very stable. They don't collapse like concrete houses would do, so they can easily adjust their housing to that, and they would move away from the coast as soon as such a hazard would actually come. This is a modern building of the government, and this is not what you see in a traditional house. A wooden house would not collapse like that and would not cause any victims. The present development is also quite extraordinary in terms of indigenous peoples, because the area has become an autonomous area. The leaders, political leaders, are native Mentawaians by now. And gradually they are moving into more and more cash crops and infrastructure, as developmental money is being poured in through Jakarta, and connections also for the tourists are increasing. Now, the latest major plan in terms of tourism is to build a sort of mega resort with an international airport and hotels. Personally, I hope it will not materialize, but that's not the point for discussion. My final example is from the Naju Dayak in central Kalimantan. The Naju Dayak are one of the many Dayak subtribes that you have in Borneo or Kalimantan. And they live in the very extensive peat swamp forest that you will find in this area of coastal central Sumatra. And the people would actually live on the elevated riverbanks. They live off shifting agriculture with rice as the main crop, and they would harvest all kinds of non-timber forest products. They too have a sort of religion that used to be called Animistic Religion, with very extensive ancestor beliefs and second burials and that kind of thing. But surprisingly, that traditional religion has now been accepted as a variant of Hinduism in Indonesia. This is what a peat swamp forest looks like from above. So the dark is all water, and it has not a very dense vegetation, and people live on the border of on the river banks. Upland agriculture, so people would cut down the trees, burn them, and then they would start planting rice. This is the cleaning of rattan. Fisheries is, of course, and these are the sort of statues that are made for their deceased ancestor. Now, there's one single challenge in addition to climate change, and that has been the draining of the forest for timber extraction. Logging in a peat swamp is extremely difficult. You can only do that because you cannot build roads. The only thing you can do it is take out the water. And then you can pull out the logs by the canals that you have been made. Yes, I have to hurry up. If you dry out the peat swamp, the peat becomes dry and it becomes susceptible to fire. And over the years, hundreds of canals have been dug in order to pull out the logs, and then also the water goes out, the peat dries out, and then you only need a little ignition, and you will get a massive forest fires, which is very difficult to go extinct. Skip that. They live now in a national park, which is for the orangutan, and of course people are forced to do something else, and they get finally into agriculture, aquaculture, and tourism, because everybody would like to see an orangutan. They have a few thousand in that area, and so they would like to come. By way of conclusion, in all the 4 cases, it is quite impressive the amount of knowledge that they have and how these people with relatively, well, it's not simple, but sophisticated technology adjusted to these environments have been able to make a living for centuries. And in addition to that, there has been sort of perceptions and worldview that were adjusted to the way they were living there. Now, in Indonesia, as well as in the Philippines, there has been little respect for these indigenous lifestyles. In many cases, there were forced conversion to religions, there was imposed development, and there has been little resistance to these outside forests. People were simply too weak, not well organized, and they had no ways of resisting this. Traditional knowledge has been transformed into modern education with little respect for the traditional ones. And as a result of that, the younger generation is being sort of alienated from the older ones. This is the final slide before you start to panic. Now, all these groups have been faced with encroachment and large-scale resource use. And this have had an enormous impact on the available options and the amount of resilience that was needed for them. Now, it is very difficult, and we have discussed it also with our PhD students. Can you differentiate between climate change and the knowledge on climate change with the impact of these other types of forms of resource extraction? And it turned out to be extremely complicated to do so, because the external interventions and activities seem to be more powerful in environmental effects than climate change as such. Of course, also these indigenous peoples have learned from NGOs and government officials a little bit about the rhetorics of climate change, and it remains to be seen what that is going to bring in the near future. Tessa Minter is a colleague of mine. I have worked very closely in the Philippines and also in Indonesia, and these are 3 PhD students from the Philippines and Indonesia who are actually doing this type of food and environmental research in the cases that I have mentioned. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we listen to 2 speakers. The message, the very powerful message I got is the local knowledge under threat because of the lifestyle changes from the imposed development, and also adding from the threat of the climate change. So the question is, how can we restore, or is possible or not possible, the local knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, or we need totally change to another way of coping. So can local knowledge add to our preparedness to deal with the climate change or not? Or should we take care of the crisis first, and then we can talk about restore the local knowledge? Now we have about 10 to 15 minutes. Now floor is open. Please identify yourself and ask whom do you want to ask. Please. Time is precious. Please go ahead.
Good morning or this afternoon. My name is Paulina. I'm from National Donghua University, Taiwan. First of all, my gratitude to both of the speakers for such amazing presentations. And I have 2 questions that I guess can be addressed to both speakers as well. So my first one is related to the work of missionaries. As we have mentioned that the introduction of a new religion might lead to the loss of previous lifestyle and traditional values and knowledge and everything. But I'm very much interested, is there a compromise? Does the introduction of a new religion necessarily mean that man loses his connection with nature? And if so, maybe there are some case studies to support that. And my second question is related to the ways of lifestyle. I'm very much curious, how can we draw kind of a line between adjustment and assimilation? And when is the time to start raising a warning sign that something wrong is happening? And just the very last question, the third one probably, what are our expectations towards indigenous communities worldwide? Do we expect them to stay this kind of perfect image on National Geographic, or do we also expect them to develop towards a certain direction? So thank you so much.
You have 3 questions.
Yeah, actually 3. The third one just came up. Thank you so much.
Shall we pick up one more question, and then we can ask the 2 speakers to respond? Remember, write down. You have questions. Can I see the hands over here? Left and right? Yes, go ahead.
I'm Shui Huang from National Taiwan University. My question goes to Professor Persoon. Thank you, but I appreciate both of the presentation, of course. Among the cases you presented, several of them actually are constantly coping with typhoons. Which is also a natural hazard that we constantly need to cope with in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, our indigenous people actually have to adapt to the state-led relocation over the past years. So I wonder, in your cases, are there any indigenous people responding to similar state intervention, and how do they deal with that? That's my question.
That's the relocation issue. It was a big problem here too. And some scientists, natural scientists, insist over 1,000 meters, nobody should live there. Everybody should move down. But then what happened was, actually when the natural disaster occurred, actually the original habitat was fine. The new relocated people has trouble. So that, who is more smarter than, who is more wiser? And okay, go ahead.
I'm from Manila.
Okay, good.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you, speakers, for such a wonderful lecture. I learned so much from this. I'd just like to know if there are initiatives by, say, NGOs to already begin to impart local knowledge in coordination with organized indigenous groups with their own NGOs.
You're talking about Taiwan or?
In any particularly much more knowledge of the Philippine case and any of those. Luzon, yeah. So I come from Luzon. Initiatives by NGOs in coordination outside the indigenous groups, in coordination with NGOs from within indigenous groups, in order to impart knowledge of local knowledge precisely with the rest of the population. I know for a fact, for example, that ACTAs have little groups coordinating with Christian groups, non-ACTA groups, so that certain information regarding how they cope. For example, how do you, basic as how to build fire when there's a typhoon and there's no electricity whatsoever, right? That's integrated into some tourism, special kind of tourism that they offer, touristic programs they offer with people from, say, Manila who go to the area. Yeah, certain initiatives. I'm thinking positive here because right now some initiatives I know must be possible, right? So we don't have to think of a time where we can gather local knowledge and begin to understand that because something is already being undertaken by certain groups. They're not mainstream groups, they're not big groups, these are really private initiatives by the inhabitants in the area.
Okay. Can I ask one more question from this side, from the left? There one left, two right. Any? No? If not, then imbalanced. Okay, that's okay. Then we ask the speaker to respond. Yeah? Please go.
Okay, thank you very much for very good questions. So you asked about the missionaries. I said in my presentation that the cultures have been destroyed by, and I mentioned also missionaries. In the case of Sami, there have been churches in that area already recordedly 1220 onwards. So there has been kind of all kind of Christian influence, different Christian denominations. There is some positive effects. So most of the Sami languages have been written first in religious texts, have been the basis of getting transliterating the spoken language and getting literary languages for Sami people. So I think there's a very high appreciation for that effort that came with it. Of course, along with came religious ideologies and I don't know, you were saying that you have to lose your connection to lands. So there are certain, at least in Finnish and Norwegian Lapland, there's a religious movement called Lestadius. He was a very powerful religious man and he has still dozens, many hundreds of followers. I think that in his speech he was himself Sami. he has kind of managed to bring together two worldviews. So that I suppose that that is one case of not contradicting the religion and missionary work. Lifestyle assimilation. I think that assimilation quite clearly that if the development takes place without your own, let's say, not from your own perspective. So assimilation can be clearly defined as something that comes from above, that forces you to give up something that you find precious and important. And normally that happens through school systems and so on. Whereas adjustment is a very difficult question. You were speaking today about resilience. I myself have a very critical view on the whole concept of resilience for the reasons that I think in this kind of framework of talking resilience, we put very much emphasis on the responsibility of an individual on matters that she cannot do anything about. I mean, climate change in the Arctic. It's warming twice as quickly as elsewhere, but the people are not fault. So to ask them to be resilient, I think that's not the correct way. And about NGOs, even to you didn't ask me, I just wanted to say that in Finland there is a very nice kind of NGO, Sami activists, researchers, collaborative thing called Snowmobile. You can check it up in the internet. And they have been, for example, very successfully revitalizing the Skolt Sami language and the Naantama River salmon together, kind of combining local knowledge and understandings of fisheries and how much language bears knowledge on fishing and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, first the missionaries. Of course, it is always a very controversial issue, and it very much depends on the sort of denomination of the missionaries, because there's a very big difference between various religions and schools of missionary activities. I remember, I wasn't like that, but I know from the when the German missionaries were invited into the Mentawai Islands, they were very strict on abolishing all what they call the pagan habits. And they were very strict that this could not be sort of tolerated one way or the other. Later on, when the Catholics came, they are pretty much more tolerant towards certain types of traditional religion. And what they call inculturation is a sort of acceptance of certain things in the sort of the Roman Catholic way of practicing the religion. Baha'i in Indonesia was at some stage also very widespread and very popular, and Baha'i was a religion that was very tolerant toward all kinds of local traditions. But then Baha'i was officially forbidden because it didn't have this belief in a single God. In terms of Islam, for instance, the fact that they forbid all kinds of pigs, for instance, and other animals as being impure, has a big impact on these types of religions. So it very much depends on the sort of religion and the impact it has on local lifestyles. Now you see that many indigenous peoples are very sort of relaxed about accepting a religion. If you want me to be a Catholic, I'll be a Catholic. If you want me to be a Muslim, I will be a Muslim, but you know, during the week I will do whatever I like. So conversion is in many cases not that black and white, but in general, in the long run, it has a major impact. In terms of lifestyle and connection to the lands, I do believe that this is something that many of the indigenous people will keep on having. It's only what you see now, in many cases, the elimination of the younger generation who define their future no longer in terms of the forest and in terms of agriculture, but they dream about mobile phones, going to the city, doing all sorts of other things. So that sort of connection and sort of disconnection between generations is something that you see in many places. Resettlement and typhoons. Of course, very often a natural disaster is being used as an argument to do all kinds of other things in terms of grouping people together, having access for government officials. So yes, people are living in dangerous places. Sometimes they need to be resettled, but in other cases there are other arguments to organize settlements at a larger scale. And of course, on the other hand, it is a task of the government to take responsibility for the survival of its people. And in cases this is not possible, then something has to be done. And by way of anecdote, of course, you probably know that I come from the Netherlands, and we live already 5 meters below sea level. And we do hope that the government takes care of us, and otherwise will resettle us, and we all settle in Germany, most likely. In terms of the initiative of local knowledge, I know of the ACTA, there are all kinds of projects by scientists and also NGOs to actually document the sort of knowledge that there is. There have been a couple of student projects to look closer in the knowledge transmission, both in the process of transmission, how ACTA sort of teach their children to do whatever they need to do to be a good ACTA, and also to document the way modern education interferes and prohibits this kind of knowledge transmission. On the other hand, documentation of local knowledge, plant species, way of procuring food is something that needs to be documented, written down, for the sake both of the ACTA as well as for the outside world, so that also the outside world can be aware of the culture they are dealing with. So far?
Yeah, so far, yes. I think time is up, and I think the person you also answered one challenge nowadays we heard a lot. They say indigenous knowledge basically is a romantic notion. Time is gone. Lifestyle is different. Those local knowledge can really help the modern way of life to help. But I think it's very important to put the modern science knowledge about sustainability and also the climate change with the local knowledge. The local knowledge can be also relearned by the mainstream people. So I think very important to document them and put them together, and then something, because your religious change, the way of belief might change. And then now the climate change is a double hazard. It's no longer like a big rain. I remember, I don't know which tribe. They know where to leave the home. They put a pot, right, a bowl, put it outside, and they say a certain level, okay, it's time to go. And then when they heard the dog bark in a certain way, they know it's dangerous. So those are knowledge. But now the dog don't bark now. They carry the dog in Taiwan. They carry the dog like a baby. The way I see dog is dog should be dog. Human should be human. And the dog carry the bag and then with the trailer, stroller. I say, oh, how's your baby? No, it's my dog. And then sometimes the people love the dog lover, love the dog like a family, and they treat other people as a family too. So my friend told me one day, he came down the stair and then the dog owner said, hello, say hello to uncle. So that's where my modern life is very interesting. But anyway, so it's interesting to document and put them together, integrate the traditional indigenous knowledge and modern science. And Taiwan is very good, and I know the Research Institute of Disaster Prepared Research Center, and they really have a very good warning system. iPhone and warning, and that should be useful too. Now, which is more accurate, which is faster? So I think these two we need to combine. That would be a good effort, and that was good. Better than they would say we are not romantic, you know, we are not nostalgic, we are forward-looking, and we know something useful there. We'll bring in and something good now, put it together. So please join me to thank these two great speakers.